This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. You know, that journey that we're all on, it starts from the moment that we give out that first cry at birth. And even though we don't have an intentional thought in our mind, you know, who we're going to be and what our name is going to be and how things are going to go forward, we're still on that journey. And sometimes other people plan it for us. And sometimes we have to, break away from the norms. My guest today, Joy, I don't want to ruin your last name. Is it Uno?
It's Ueno.
Uno. Okay. So Joy is with me today, and it's important that you know her last name because she's also an author, and I want to make sure that people can get out there and read your books. And I see you have a little furry friend behind you too. He is so cute. I met Joy through podmatch.com. And when I read her little bio, my first thought was, come on, this doesn't happen. You don't just open your front door one day and find a purple journal waiting for you. And I thought, well, there's got to be more to it. So I read it, a couple months ago, and maybe I'm going to invite her on because I got to learn more about it. But when I read it today, it struck a chord of truth. It's not just a storyline. It's something that happened to you. And you say that there was more that happened prior to that made you truly start to understand it. So, Joy, let our listeners know what I'm rambling about so that they can understand your journey.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So I had this relationship. I'm about to turn 40, but when I was 19, I'd been in a relationship with someone and we had a very strong connection. And we, over the years, sort of figured out that it was a bit of a psychic connection. So things would happen, like he'd get into a car accident and I'd feel like shoved, or he would be moving and I hadn't heard from him like maybe more than a year. And then he'd be moving and I just feel like, oh, I need to get in touch with him. And it was always like that. And I knew that it scared him at first. And then over time, he kind of got used to it. But we went our separate ways, but we were still in touch. And then about 13 years ago, I saw him and we hadn't seen each other in a long time. And he was living on Kauai and he asked me to marry him. And it was sort of, I had just gotten out of a relationship and there were a lot of things. If I have a podcast called The Glimmering and I talk in much more detail about what that relationship was like. But I'm sorry, my corgi is eating packing peanuts. But I said no, and I just knew that it was not the right time for me and not the right time for him. And it was sort of tumultuous and we ended up not speaking for a decade, for about 9 years. And when the pandemic, it was like February of the pandemic, I kept hearing people talk about how we need to finish our unfinished business and say the things we need to say because you don't know when you're going to go. And I immediately thought of him, and I call him Jack. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take this away from her.
Oh, that's okay. Sure.
And so I reached out to him because I immediately thought of him and I knew that I needed to get in touch and things had not ended well. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. It just kept coming up and kept coming up. And I reached out to him and he wanted to talk, didn't want to talk. And I knew, because we had this psychic connection and things like this had happened before, I knew that he would get in touch with me when he was ready. I knew that it wasn't the end. And one day I woke up and I woke up on Father's Day of that year and I could feel like, if you were on the other side of a curtain from someone,
right,
you would still feel that they were there. That's exactly what it felt like that day. And I knew he was going to get in touch with me, and he did. And we kind of communicated, but things were strange. Like, so I knew something strange was going on with him. And in that period of time, my parents had sent this box of like yearbooks and journals and things from my childhood home. And in that, there was this lavender journal that Jack had given me when I was 19. And I hadn't really been thinking about him a lot until that point. So it was really strange that this lavender journal showed up. And so we were talking, we had exactly a week, and exactly a week later, I found out. I opened up my phone, and one of his friends had posted that he had passed. He was only 41, and he had collapsed on a trail hiking in Kauai. And I just, I was just so stunned and so grief-stricken. And I think it was hard for people to understand because we hadn't spoken in 10 years, and I'm married, and, I'm happily married. But because of that connection, it was like this part of me had died. It was really, really terrible grief. And a few weeks later, I would say 3 weeks later, I had a reading with this medium named Carol Cottrell. And Carol never has readings. Like, the fact that I got a reading with Carol just on a whim 3 weeks after he passed was now I know was very, very surprising. And so I had this reading with Carol, and she brought all these things through, and she said, oh, there's a male presence here. He died quickly and suddenly. He had problems with substance abuse, and you met him when you were a teenager, all of these things that no one could have known. Oh, you had a psychic connection. He's showing me a crystal ball. And one of the last things she said was, as she was bringing forth evidence, was, oh, he says that he sent you this lavender journal. Like, he gave you this lavender journal. He's showing it to me. It has like a big drawing of a flower on the front page. And I had drawn a lily on the front page of this journal. And she said, yeah, he says to keep writing to him in it, and that he'll be reading every word. And that, more than anything, all of the other stuff was so accurate. But the thing about the journal, and the fact that it had just shown up on my doorstep, and I hadn't asked for it, and I hadn't thought about it in years, it really was the last thing that I needed to open this door for me into this new life and this new understanding of spirituality and who I really am and why we're really here. And it, in that beginning stage, Carol had actually said to me, like, he says, this is a gift, his passing, and you don't see it that way now, but you will. And I thought, that's so strange. Like, why would this be a gift to me? But it really has been.
As I'm listening to your story, we all have somebody from our past that we haven't had closure with. We may not have thought we needed it at any point, but you get to a certain stage of life, and all of a sudden you think about somebody, and it's like, I wonder what they're doing, or I didn't like the way we left things the last time. But sometimes that's your thoughts, not necessarily theirs. And so that can keep you from that connection. It must have been difficult for you over those 9 years or so of, connecting, but then having a disconnect.
Yeah, it was a decision that I'd made. It had been many years of, because we had known each other for 10 years by the time we stopped talking for 9 years. And it was just toxic in that it felt like I couldn't move forward with my life. He didn't really want me to, but he could.
Yeah.
And there was also, there was alcoholism involved. We were very opposite in a lot of ways. So he was an alcoholic, and I'm like allergic. Like, I'll pass out if I have a quarter of a glass of wine. So there was like always this kind of tension. And finally, when I decided to get married to my husband, I said, listen, I don't think we should talk anymore. I just feel like this is just a toxic dynamic, and I want you to move on and I want to be able to move on. But I knew there were a lot of times where I would feel him kind of thinking about me, and he'd be very present, and it was sticky. I couldn't,
Yeah.
separate from it. So I knew what was happening because that's what it had been like for the previous decade. But I just never reached out because I didn't want to make things messy for either of us. But by the time the spring of 2020 rolled around, I thought, well, if I'm going to, because I really thought, I live in Boston. So the super spreader event was here. And I thought, well,
Right.
if I go, I'd like him to know. And it turned out to be the opposite. And he didn't
Right.
get COVID, but it was, the timing
Sure.
of it.
So prior to getting the journal, did you believe that you had a spiritual presence in your life? Could you feel that previously?
So I grew up in Hawaii. And Hawaii is an incredibly spiritual place. So I had known that there was something else going on. My grandfather, after he passed, we would have this butterfly that would show up every time my grandmother came to our house, and it would just circle the backyard. And she would stay overnight and it would circle the backyard. And then as soon as she left, it would leave. And we'd had this experience too at his funeral where he sent a bird, and this bird sat on the hood of the limousine that took us from the shrine to her house. And we went on the freeway, and that bird just like stayed on that car.
Interesting.
My dad kept saying, that bird, I don't know how it's still there. And then as soon as we got to her building, it flew away. So we knew, I knew that there were spiritual things, and there are so many legends in Hawaii that I've had experiences of driving over bridges and seeing spirits and things like that. But I had so separated from it over the years, and my 20s and 30s, trying to like have money and live in a house and figure out what was going on in my career, that I really wasn't in a spiritual place. And this brought it all back for me and more. So it wasn't just legends and stories and signs, but like actual communication.
So what I'm trying to understand is that when you were living in Hawaii, there was an influence that became part of your life. When you left Hawaii and you're here working, you don't have much of a choice at that point other than to think about, putting food on the table and getting to work and things like that. So I can see how most of our environments, we're not allowing the spiritual into our lives. We're stopping it before it happens because, hey, you're going to distract me and I can't be distracted. I
Yeah.
have to be an adult, as you said. And your story means so much to me because I have two sons, and my youngest son knows his paternal grandfather intimately. And his paternal grandfather died 3 years before he was born.
Wow.
And he talks about his grandfather in such a way that my husband actually has to leave the room because he's talking about his father, and he's going, but you've never met. And yet the words that come out of his mouth, the things that he says, he has to have a connection.
Yeah.
Because it's not even the things that my husband knows about those things, but he didn't have those connections himself. So it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to tell you a story about Grandpa and I.
Yes.
And my son has always been very open to things that are going on around him. And I remember he was about 13 or 14. And he is on the autism spectrum. He's at the high end. And he was telling his doctor one day, I do hear voices. And the doctor sort of looked at him and looked at me and said, do you think we should change medication? And my son put his hand up. He said, no, you don't understand. I feel those are the voices. And we sat in the doctor's office for 2 hours as my son explained it to him. And he goes, I'm so sorry. I was trying to diagnose you when you were telling me what you feel. So how do you bring that spirituality now into your life as a wife, as a mom to fur babies, as a writer? Do you have time to let things open up? And
wow. So I'm very fortunate. First of all, I'm friends with a medium named Marilyn Kapp. I'm very fortunate to know her. And through my friend Carrie is the 4th episode on my podcast, and her daughter passed at 22 on her birthday. And almost immediately they started getting all of these signs, specifically iridescent ribbons. So almost like Easter grass, but iridescent. And that was Michaela's favorite color, was iridescence. And as soon as they told us about that, we started finding iridescent ribbons, my husband and I. So my husband is a particularly open and understanding person. And he's in fact, everyone's first question is always, what does James think about all of this? And the whole final episode, so my first season of my podcast is 6 episodes because they're very narrative driven and edited, but he is it's like a storytelling podcast, kind of like This American Life. And the whole last episode is about him because he's been on a journey. So I think at first he was a little bit nervous that this was going to lead into, like cult kind of territory. But he said, he's known me since I was 22. And he knows that I'm not someone who's easily duped by things. And as my journey progressed, things started happening to him. So one day, and this is the story that we told on the podcast, one of them, but one day we were in the house and he had gone into the bathroom, and we have a Google Home in there, and he always likes to ask for the news. Like doing his business. Love it. And he said, Google, play the flash news briefing. And then I heard him laughing, and I thought, nothing in the news is this funny. What is he laughing about? And he came out and he said, you're so funny. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, I said, play the flash news briefing, and you flashed the lights on me. Because in New England, we have the lights outside the bathroom. I said, I was nowhere near the bathroom. And he said, shut up. These lights went on and off, on and off, on and off, like very intentionally, not flickering or anything. And I said, spirits. And about a week later or so, I had a reading with this medium that I work with named Carissa Eve. And I hadn't said anything about any of this. And she said, oh, your grandmothers are there, your grandmother and your husband's grandmother, they're in your house. They like to hang out. They found the house for you, which makes sense. And they said they've been trying to get him on board with your awakening. So they've been turning the lights on and off on him. Has that been happening? Yes. More and more. And then, we would find the iridescent ribbons from Carrie's daughter, Michaela, and all of that stuff. And more he started having his own experiences of spirit. But the reason I brought up our friend Marilyn Kapp, who's a spiritual medium, and her mentor was Elie Wiesel, who was, in the Holocaust,
right,
and wrote the book Night. She actually says that people, like babies who come in, are held by the ancestors who are out of body on the other side before they come in. So of course they know the people who have passed because they knew them before they even knew us.
Interesting.
And so it's really beautiful because I think, and she also says, that people who have, who are on the autism spectrum, they're just, vibrating at a higher frequency. And so the reason they're able to pick up on these things is because they have these gifts. So that makes total sense to me that your son is having those experiences.
And another thing that happened to us, and happened to be regarding my dad, my father had been ill for many years, and he'd fight back, and we'd be called up to Michigan, and we were being told, say your goodbyes, and we'd go in and say our goodbyes, and 10 minutes later he's sitting up in a chair, and he's fine.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Mm-hmm.
And so my son one day said to us, he said, when he finally passes, it's going to be at night, because he doesn't want to say goodbye. And I just thought, okay, maybe you're right. We can, flip a coin, because it's going to either be day or night, right? And he did pass at night. And when I woke my son up that night, he goes, yeah, I know. He said, everything is fine. But the night of his funeral, family was gathered for evening prayer. And just as we were about to start, the lights went off. We all giggled. My mother in her 80s and the little kids that were there too, we all just started laughing. And the first thing we said was, Harmon, what are you doing? And then the lights went back on.
Yeah.
And my son has said this has happened to him numerous times now that he's living alone, where, he's feeling lonely, and his lights either turn on because they've been off, and then they turn back off, and he has that feeling of calm. You know what? My grandfather is here. Everything is all right. And for outsiders, if you haven't experienced it or seen it, we think it's all, hey, it's fantasy. But even if it is, if it makes us feel good, what's wrong with that?
Yeah. And I think also sometimes from the outside, people think that it sounds scary.
Oh, it is.
And it's not scary when it's your loved ones. It's your grandfather or your grandmothers, they're just, mine like to put out, like if they think we're not eating enough protein, I'll put out a sheet pan, because I only use that pan to make chicken. And I'll say to my husband, like, did you put this out? And he'll say, no. Did you put it out? I'll say, no. And I'll say, oh, they think we need more protein. And I say things like that, and people are like, oh, poltergeist. And I'm like, they just want us to eat more chicken. Like, it's nothing, it's nothing scary. It's just being grandmotherly,
So when you've shared these stories with others, do you find that people finally like gravitate into it and go, you know what? Joy is as normal as anybody else that I would know. Yeah, I'm going to become more intentional.
Yes. I think people were I think a lot of people at first were like, well, we know Joy, and Joy's very grounded, so she wouldn't be like making this up. But I think it wasn't until they listened to the podcast. A lot of them I told these stories to, but they listened to the podcast and they could see how all the pieces fit together, because it's serial. So every one of them connects to the other. And it starts with my story, and then it tells Carol's story, and she was the first medium, and then my friend, and how my guides led me to, basically I asked for community around this, because it is lonely. And I would tell people, and they would be a little weird about it, right? So I asked for friends who were going through also spiritual awakenings, and it turned out that they were people I already knew. And I was being brought to them one by one, including my husband, who lived in my house. So it was, it was definitely, the reactions were a little standoffish at first, but when they listened to the podcast, a lot of, even in fact, if you look at the reviews, a lot of people have said, this because of the way this is laid out and the way it unfolds, because I have a background as a writer, so that's the way I saw it unfold. It woke me up to my own magic, and it made me remember that I'd had these experiences too, and now I'm looking for them in my day-to-day life where I wasn't before.
Absolutely.
And it's happening to everyone all around, but it's not until we take notice of it that, like, I think more happens when you're noticing it.
Absolutely. We started a new podcast a year ago called Grief Belief. And we have a panel of 4. 3 of the women have lost spouses. One has not lost a spouse, but has an estrangement loss. And as they walk us through what grief is all about, part of it we're learning is that you can sometimes get through that grief if you allow yourself to just feel what's around you and not be so afraid. And sometimes we have to block out the rest of the world initially to get that calm, to get us to where we need to be. And we all deal with grief differently. And there's no cookie cutter, and there never should be. The same way, I may not have a spiritual being who actually comes to me like my son does. But when he talks to me about his 2 grandfathers, I feel like I have a blanket around me. That they're there. They don't have to talk to me. They don't have to make me visualize them, because he's bringing them to me. And I think that's because of an open mind and saying, hey, I'm looking for comfort.
Yeah.
And I will take the comfort in any way that I can get it.
My friend Carrie always says, she actually dislikes that we keep saying that she says this, because she's like, did I get that from somewhere else? But she says the awareness of the connection is the connection. And so I think it's important for people to know that. I think one of the best things about a spiritual awakening is this realization that you've never been alone. So all of us have loved ones and beings around us, whether or not we can hear them or see them, or we want to hear from them or see them. And I think that we come here to experience, like, we incarnate in order to experience contrast. And one of those experiences is grief, because there is no greater growth engine than grief,
Right.
And you find that you have these choices in grief to choose to continue to live happily and, like, find your happiness and experience life, or kind of like fade away. And I think anytime people choose that path of happiness, everyone is celebrating.
Exactly.
That's exactly what you want, and it's what your soul wants. And that when you do that, and that process involves feeling all the feelings and finding your way back to the light, that's when your soul experiences growth. And then when you come into your next lifetime, you can have new lessons that you're going to learn.
I love it. So you mentioned that your background is as a writer, and you've written a couple of books. So talk to us a little bit about your book.
So I've written one book.
One book. Okay.
And I'm in the process of getting it published right now. And basically what had happened was that spring of 2020, I just and now I know what it feels like, that's your guides. When you feel this push and you're like, I don't know what this is. I felt very strongly that I needed to write something that was sort of inspired by that relationship, that had these, like, elements of spirituality in them. And when I say spirituality, I feel like people get a little weirded out, like that's going to be religious. And it's not, it's just this kind of connection with the other side. And so I had started writing something. And then when Jack passed, I put it down for a good, 6 months. And then the day that I started writing again, it was December, and I'd made a fire in the fireplace, and I let it die because I'm afraid of burning my house down. Took the dogs around the block, and I came back, the fire had been out for 45 minutes. So it was just ashes in the fireplace. And I sat down to write, and I get a lot of messages through music. So if people are looking to connect with their loved ones on the other side, they can always ask for music, like what should I do about this? Turn on, Spotify or Pandora and see what plays and see if the message resonates with you. So I had turned on my music, and all of a sudden this song came on. It was called I'm With You. In fact, it played right before I got on with you. And then the fire in the fireplace came back to life. It was just a little flame, and it came up, and it lasted for the duration of the song, and then it went out again. And I thought, oh, something magical is happening here. And by that point, I'd taken Carol's mediumship class. So I was starting to communicate and understand the signs and things like that. And the whole process of writing the book has been magical and healing. And it's so many of the lessons that I learned during that time that made their way into the book. And so each draft was like another layer of my experiences and my healing, and also the characters' experiences and healing. And as time went on, they became way less us and more their own people. So,
and it's interesting when you talk to a writer about their characters. I said many, many years ago, I was going to write a book, and I sat down to write, and I realized, no, I don't want to write a book. I like writing my blogs. I like writing about what is important to me right now.
yes.
I'm going to let writing go to everybody else. But I realized that I get caught up in the story and who I see as the characters, and they start becoming part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to learn how to separate myself from all that. In fact, my husband mentioned the other day, he said, I know you're binge watching something because you keep asking for Hazel. And she was one of the main characters.
Yes.
And it was like, I didn't realize I was doing that, but it made sense because I was thinking about her all the time because I had been binge watching. So
I do think that I think that a lot of times the information that comes through in shows and novels and things like that are channeled. Like there is something that needs to be known in the collective that's some kind of truth that's coming through that. And I think that one way of getting us to think about those truths is by making these characters feel like people in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of that recently. So
Yeah.
Tell us how our listeners can find you, and of course, listen to your podcast, because I've gone in and listened to bits and pieces. I didn't listen to it all the way through. Now I got to go back and go from one to the
I would
end.
love that.
But tell us how we can find you.
It's on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. And if people want to, what happens a lot of times is that people listen to the 6 episodes and they're like, where is there more? And I just started on Substack. So it's joyuyeno.substack.com. And I send out a weekly newsletter that's sort of in that vein of spirituality and magic and things like that. And then I also, about a year ago, realized that I'm part of a mediumship practice group that I channel spirit guides. So each month I post an energy update from my spirit guides for the collective. And that's there as well.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I think people need to just open their minds a little bit, be more intentional about what's around them. Because there's a beautiful world out there. And it's about time that, we see the positive more than the negative. So I thank you for your time. And I look forward to listening to the podcast all the way through.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day, Joy. Bye-bye now.